Hi, my name is Joe Jackson, and Tom Murphy is my favourite Irish playwright and definitely was one of my favourite interviewees. In fact, the interview we did in 1991 is one of my favourite interviews, largely because before I became an interviewer, and ever since, one of my goals was to create a work for theatre, which I love. As it transpires, I finally did in 2016 when I performed my one-person show, Richard Harris Revisited. Either way, all of this is why I was truly saddened on May the 15th, 2018, when I learned that Tom had died. At the time, as an independent producer, I was presenting on RTE Radio 1 a series titled The Joe Jackson Tapes Revisited. Privately, and pretentiously perhaps, given that I had always perceived my interviews to be a form of theatre, I saw those shows as like two-hander plays, in a way. And so my immediate reaction to Tom's death was to drop a show I had intended doing about Mike Murphy and to revisit instead that 1991 interview I did with Tom, plus a follow-up interview we did a decade later. The programme was meant to be broadcast in August 2018. Sadly, a conflict that was legal, personal and political led to the show and the series being pulled. Not only that, a powers that be in RTE told me the Murphy programme had not held his attention for an hour. This, ironically enough, was said the same day the Irish Times chose the show as the radio programme of the day and said it was a fitting tribute to a brilliant mind. Is it, or is it boring? You decide. But I dedicate this podcast to the memory of Tom Murphy and to those of us who love his work. The full text of both interviews will be available on my new website, joejacksoninterviewer.com. Enjoy. Tom Murphy is one of Ireland's leading playwrights, sharing the ever-shifting top position with fellow thespian Brian Friel. In fact, there are those who believe Murphy holds his cracked and shadowed mirror in front of the Irish psyche and reflects the zeitgeist in a manner that is rarely as consistently matched by any of his contemporaries. Said who? A patently pretentious prat called Joe Jackson in the preface of the 1991 interview you're about to hear tonight. But in this, the year of the man's death, I stand over every word I wrote. In fact, my fondest memory of the interview is something Tom did after it was over, and that tells us a lot about how meticulous the man was, as is evident from the musicality of his plays. Very often, if someone I interview talks about a sensitive subject, such as, say, in Murphy's case, the damage his commitment to art may have done to his family, I offer to read over the phone the relevant quote before it goes to press. After I did so for Tom, he remained silent for about a minute. I sensed that he was instinctively revising every word I'd read. I was right. He then said, "Joe, do you mind if I fact you a better, by which I mean more accurate and hopefully more truthful quote?" I said, "Of course I don't." He did so, and I inserted that quote, though tonight you'll hear the original quote. Then again, even prior to the paragraph change, Murphy had been so precise and word-perfect an interviewee that I ran the article basically as a Q&A, because it read like a one-act play, something that I, as a would-be dramatist, often set out to achieve. Though the 2-hour-long interview did have to be tailored to suit its setting in a rock magazine. But it was only while listening to the tapes for the first time in 27 years while preparing this show, I realised that lost in the process were some of Tom's more labyrinthine flights of literary fancy. This struck me as particularly unfortunate, given that at one point Tom says, and this is something I too believe, that we are all trying to fly, in a spiritual, perhaps post-religious sense. Either way, during this programme, no such restrictions on flights will be enforced. But first, a few facts. Tom was born in Tuam, County Galway in 1935, and in 1959 he wrote his first play with Noel O'Donoghue, the tellingly titled On the Outside. I saw you said somewhere that you grew up feeling like a Martian. Is that a healthy perspective for an artist or a playwright?
I would say it is now. I wouldn't wish it on anybody if that is a type. I'm not being a martyr, but I wouldn't wish that to be the price of writing a few plays. I think that in the nature of most writers, that there's an element of the orphan complex about them all. Right. And that pursuant on that, there's the business of writing. There is a large element of exhibitionism in it, to say, look at me, no hands. Or in another sense, look at me, I exist too. I belong here too.
There's a culture that existed, and I'm sure it exists today in every family situation, whether it is spoken or whether it is tacit.
The young person feels that he or she is being compared with somebody next door. In my case, it wasn't intellectual achievement that I was being compared with. It was things like the fact that the guy who lived next door to me could drink 5 cups of tea in the morning. I could drink 1, but my mother didn't see that I could eat half a cake, and the cake was a 1.5 foot in diameter. That achievement went unnoticed. But I cite that to show how endemic this business of comparison is, and that no matter how intelligent or otherwise one is, that there's a degree of sensitivity, and that feeling of being different is there. And as I say, an ET, feeling like an ET, and in those days the ETs had no credits going for them, unlike today.
Is it true that part of the root of your need to create alternative realities began with you inventing a twin brother as a buffer against being perceiving of yourself as the underdog of the family, or being bossed around?
I don't know that I was bossed around. I think that perhaps it came more from the fact that I had been at the receiving end willingly at the start. Like, I did try to shed that in later life and to say I have to declare myself, and that I am an individual. I happen to belong to a family, but first of all, I'm an individual. I think that in creating a twin brother incidentally was younger than me, which is very strange, because he had to be younger, though a twin, which was rather romantic. He had to be younger because the pecking order had to be there, and I had to be able to not so much tick him off, but to give him good advice, tell him how to be wise.
Well, I get a sense of self-importance from that.
To give yourself
that sense of
self-importance.
But do you see that as setting down a pattern then that no, I don't like to say cause and effect is as simple as that, but that kind of would lead you towards creating alternative realities on stage or whatever, on the page?
I'd never thought about it, and I don't know. All I could find more things in my past that would suggest inclinations towards creativity rather than that one. That at the age of, I was perhaps 9, there was great cult and interest of business in heavyweight boxing. But I remember writing a history of heavyweight boxing, and on the night before I wrote it, a man was killed in the town, and I felt that should be recorded also for the edification of future generations. And I remember burying it in the garden, and I'm sure some enterprising archaeologist will find it someday. There was that kind of thing. Plus, there was I was the second radio in the street. We talk about the televisions, everybody has televisions now. But there was one radio in the street, and peculiarly this radio was known as Mrs. Ford's radio. She had a husband, but it wasn't his radio, it was her radio. And the chosen few were let in to her house on a Sunday night, and I was among the chosen few. And I don't know whether my imagination is playing tricks with me, but the news would be listened to, and there'd be suitable grunts to register what is being said. I seem to remember, I'm not sure, somebody changing the knobs of the radio to get, I think, Lord Haw. And there was a degree of celebration about the Germans. Then there was a tenor called Bill Thompson, who must have belonged to the choir or the rep in radio, and he would sing things like the Snowy-Breasted Pearl. And then that was followed by the Sunday night play, the bells, those great melodramas. And I still have great wonder about the disembodied voice. And indeed, I'd like to have enough money to write for radio if I so wish to, but unfortunately I can't afford it. But following on the radio on this, what perhaps can lead to going into creativity business in terms of literature or whatever. When I say I was the second radio in the street, there was an old gas stove in the yard, and I could fit into the oven of that. And I had my feed man, if you like, the oldest friend in the world. We wrote a play subsequently together on the outside, Noel O'Donoghue. But he would twiddle the knobs on the gas stove, and I would sing.
And you haven't stopped since.
That kind of thing.
Right.
So that, say, in my middle 20s, when I really started to pursue the writing thing, I thought that this was a flash in the pan that had come out of nowhere, that had started solely because I was part of the Tune Theatre Guild, which is a very old theatre guild and a very good one. And it's only for purposes of, say, doing interviews and that I remember those things, that the indications, in fact, were there.
Well, there's one you haven't mentioned that I've seen referred to, and you can either describe it as an escapist tendency or a redemptist tendency, and that's the frequent flights to the cinema, or through the cinema.
Yeah.
I mean, would that have also, I believe, films like La Strada, these were, again, alternative realities.
Yeah.
And that played a big part.
Yeah. Somebody, the last full or major thing I did was a film, which I finished last October.
Right.
And somebody said to me, "Oh, we've always thought of you as a playwright."
Right.
But I was pointing out that our background, my generation, is more to do with film than stage. That we were fortunate enough to see McMaster occasionally. I know I saw him twice in my life. But I got to the cinema once a week and longed for it.
Right.
Well, I must have been quite young when I saw, and it was a Sunday afternoon. I know it was a Sunday afternoon, but I wasn't at all precocious. But I saw a film of Glass Menagerie on a Sunday afternoon, and there was a couple who seemed elderly to me at the time. They were probably in their 30s, but I was walking with this couple, and they said something to the effect, "What was all that about?" And they were frowning, and they were annoyed. And I said something to the effect of, "I thought it was great," which I don't know why I remember that, or why on earth it should have got through to me. But when I see it now, it is really beautiful and fine play.
Did I also read that your sister or someone within the family was forbidden to go to see Williams' Streetcar Named Desire in film form?
That's right, which perhaps made me prick up my ears later. But A Streetcar Named Desire arrived in the town, and Legion Mary were told not to go near it. And my sister and I think 5 other girls went to see it, and they were turfed out. And it was perhaps 4 years later, 5 years later, I picked up a copy of The Streetcar Named Desire. My eye caught it, and reading that play was definitely a punctuation mark in my life. I'd read Chekhov and Ibsen and Strindberg and so on, and there were really chalk marks on the wall. I know that I didn't understand, and it's in retrospect I'm analysing my own excitement, but Williams is a very poetic writer, yet the language is so stage-worthy, it's always stage-worthy, and it's charged with the type of energy, say, that Arthur Miller could never achieve. And that was a great release for me. In the first play I wrote with O'Donoghue, I'd written a few pages of dialogue, and he said, "My God, that's terrible." And it was. But I feel that I got some sort of release through reading A Streetcar. I'll admit also that it was an impression that it made on me rather than my comprehending the thing, because I read the play and I hardly saw Blanche in the play at all. And the play, of course, is about Blanche more than it is about Stanley. When it was Stanley, I saw Stanley and the dialogue, and I never read anything in a play like this guy before, or talking. I got a lawyer acquaintance, etc., etc. But I recognized this person. Williams ultimately, well, he's writing Tragedy, he celebrates life. He retaliates against life in celebration. There's a bit of a paradox there.
Williams celebrated life and he retaliated against life in celebrating life. Maybe, as Tom said, a bit of a paradox, but it is true to the soul of the work of Tennessee Williams. Not only that, Murphy may just as well have been talking about his own aesthetic. Either way, next up, taking my cue from Tennessee Williams' wonderful line in The Glass Menagerie, where Murphy's namesake Tom, the narrator, says of his absent father, he was a telephone operator who fell in love with long distances. I asked Murphy this question.
Okay, your father was a tradesperson forced to work abroad, and there is that image in A Whistle in the Dark Open with the impending arrival of the father on the train. Did that sense or the absent father syndrome lead to a sense that a broken family is the natural order?
Well, I wouldn't say that a broken family is the natural order. I think that I still believe very much in the family unit, providing that the members of the family aren't trying to kill each other within that unit.
Right.
That a unit can become a blood knot, and then it's better to explode it and let the individual units pursue their own directions. Well, I think that the idea of the family is astonishingly beautiful, and I do deeply regret that the economics of the time were so severe that my father had to emigrate when I was 9 years of age when he left, and I was 26 years of age when he came back. And indeed, I'm already conscious, before you brought up that question, I think I mentioned my mother's house several times to you.
That's right.
And I mentioned my mother,
Right.
which it's like lifting the parent, the male parent figure out of the place, and he becomes almost obliterated. My father became redundant to me,
Right. Yeah.
which I think is sadder still for him, because he was forced to emigrate, and my father must have felt totally unnecessary. It is a theme that runs through fathers generally, as far as I've observed them, and indeed looked at myself as a father, but then it's emphasized if a situation arises like the one that I'm suggesting possibly existed within me, that the man was unnecessary.
Later, Tom and I would return to the subject of the absent father, more specifically his own absence from his own family, even when, as you'll see, he was working at home. At this point, we talked about the fact that Tom, having moved from a Christian Brothers school to a tech, a school change I too made, which he said was seen to be for the stupidest and the poorest, sharpened even more so his awareness of class barriers. But, of course, tech prepared Tom for factory life in the Tuam Sugar Company.
Actually, I know you don't like pinning your plays down to what's commonly described as autobiographical, but they are on a kind of subterranean level, like Williams's work and stuff like that. They do operate, like even the context where you've just described as like the context for your first play with On the Outside. I mean, you draw on those experiences. Why do you shy away from the autobiographical tag? Because it's too reductionist or too limiting?
I think it is too reductionist. I think, though, that I've been too severe or rigid in my denial of what is autobiographical and what is not.
Okay.
That I'm not quite sure what the play comes from, or what the germinal idea for a play is, which is totally different from, say, the triggering action. Most of the plays that I've written are very autobiographical in mood,
Okay.
which is a totally different thing to being pure autobiography. There are details punctuate or pepper the plays that I've written, which are autobiographical, but they become necessary details to a fabric of a piece that is holding together the mood of a piece. And because they're there, I can sometimes project myself more readily into a situation whereby a character is more stupid, more clever, younger, older. I think that one of the reasons that I've hitherto been denying so emphatically an autobiographical thing is because ultimately the play has to transcend not just me, but the characters themselves. That my attitude towards writing is that, in a way, it is a retaliation. I was saying earlier that you go to the tech, you're aware of class consciousness in the town, you try whistling, it's a better whistler than the next guy. You move on from whistling and you want to say, watch me, no hands. You're retaliating at that level. Then you move on and the pendulum swings very fast on me and fairly frequently. And I resent being such total victim to those moods. I resent being a victim to anything, being a puppet of an emotion or a mood. So in retaliation, I think part of writing is trying to recreate those feelings and say, look, I can create those feelings too.
But more than life, I can transcend them and hopefully turn them into some kind of work of art.
Right.
People generally tend to be frightened of using the word art. What on earth is wrong with that?
Sure.
If you mould something that is a cohesive whole, is imbued with the mood of something and an energy that actors are going to find and reproduce and bring their magic to it, that it is all based on something that has come from life, but eventually
Right.
it is man-made, and
Right.
man becomes the creator.
And the goal is transcendence.
Transcendence, yeah. And back to the point, we're saying that certainly there, like in the Geely concert, there's a line from the Irishman. He's forced by JPW to talk about his first sexual encounter. That is an autobiographical detail. A lady of, she was perhaps 14, 15, 16, I don't know, took me to the end of our garden where the potatoes were, took me down on top of her between the drills, kept putting sweets into my mouth while she was trying to get my Mickey into her. As I say in reply, I enjoyed the sweets, but my Mickey was too young to repay her treat. That is an autobiographical detail.
Seagull is there, seeming to accentuate the fabulously absurd nature of Tom's story and reminding me of Chekhov's play The Seagull. By the way, at this point I was 4 years into my tenure as a theatre columnist for Hot Press, but I plainly operated a much lower plane, I'm hanging on to the flying metaphor, than say my highly elevated peer in the Irish Times, Fintan O'Toole. And during my interview with Tom, I did quote an observation Fintan had made about Murphy's work. Incidentally, I had told Tom that having moved from a CBS school to a tech, I became like him a sheet metal worker. Hence, my following comment about metalers is tongue-in-cheek.
Well, I've seen the two descriptions I saw, that one hallmark of your work is this blend of someone said personal anguish, which I don't know if I'd agree with, personal anguish and social realities. And Fintan says that even from on the outside, you were able to transmute the social observations into the metaphorical and the metaphysical. But I mean, that they sound like very heady concepts for an ex-metaler.
They do.
You know what I mean?
Indeed,
so is the process conscious, or is that just...
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's not conscious. That's Fintan's trade. One of the things that astonish me, I have, I think, 6 theses at this stage, and there are 5 others being written at the moment. And these are done by young people. Now, easily the most successful one, as far as I'm concerned, is one that was written by a Belgian student in Dutch.
Right.
So I don't understand a word of it. Now, that's a valid reason, but I understand very, very little of a lot of these other theses that happen. When I receive them, as I say, it surprises me because they come from young people that they seem to be blindly following a tradition in academics that labels things in the way that I can't even repeat the phrases that you say.
Is there would there be part of a process where you read these and they can become inhibiting or intimidating or make you feel constricted when you go to write the next work, to say, oh, now who is going to further analyze this down the line?
Yeah, it's there's a degree of that, but I think that if a work, whether it's a play or whatever it is, gets going, that there's such a total selfishness about the writing that you tend to forget. You forget there's a woman lying bleeding in the street, and that's tough luck. So you forget the academics. It's just yourself. It's very self-centered.
That comment about leaving a woman bleeding while one focused on finishing a play was one that many of Tom's peers would later respond to during interviews with me, starting with John McGarhan, who said that he, in contrast with Murphy, would tear down the Sistine Chapel in order to help a bleeding woman. Either way, what Tom had said took me way off script, as in my list of typed questions, and, as you'll hear, it is at the end of this section I ask for his phone number in terms of that potentially perilous quote.
Is that why, and you don't have to answer the question, is that why, if your marriage has failed, would that be the reason? Must everybody, family, wives, children and all, lie bleeding outside the door while you write?
Well, it's certainly a question I've thought about.
I don't want to sound like the crucified writer, but it seems to be the only thing I can do. And that I think that ultimately, I suppose, wives or one, I really don't particularly want to go into it.
Okay.
They wouldn't agree.
Well, can you just talk about it? Because I had to put the question to you arising out of what you said. So can you answer it without, hurting anyone or revealing anything that could cause pain to anyone? I want to avoid that as much as anyone.
Yeah.
But I'd still like the core question.
Yeah, put the core question, George.
Well, the core question is that just the sense, and I've talked to, like, Paul Durkin has said something similar, and Frank McGuinness said something similar, that there is this cannibalization of life, and it involves everything and everyone around you, and can lead to the destruction of the human relationships that a lot of other people build their lives on.
Well, the creative business, as I know it, is certainly conducive towards destroying bonds that exist between the bonds that exist with one's closest. That in the process, and when one gets into the deepest process, when the stuff is going well, it is a totally selfish business. That I find that in writing something that's going well, and I sometimes get up 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, and so I look at a clock and it's 10 to 7, and the next time I look at the clock it's 10 past 2. Now that's as close as I can get to not just forgetting my nearest and dearest, but to forgetting myself, that time has no meaning, that I have stepped out of time. And if I have an ability to do that, which when I call it an ability, it happens very rarely, but that I seek that transcendence of the self in the actual doing of the thing. I'm discovering the thing that I'm writing in the process of doing it. I shed myself, but I also shed other people, but I'm emphasizing that I shed myself also.
Right, but you do also have to find then, as part of that process, either a lover or a wife or children who can cancel out their own needs while you're going through that process, don't you?
I don't know that this is very dangerous ground, but I haven't thought about it that deeply, and more particularly to the point that you're making, that I need a particular person to compensate in human companionship.
Mm-hmm. Or that they had better not have needs that are too deep, that won't be met when you're transcending self.
There is a feeling that in terms of human relationship, there's always that question about am I so totally treacherous, ruthless, etc., and that if it comes to it, will I go for a minor degree of ecstasy that's being pretentious about it, as against an ongoing human relationship. I know that when, despite everything I've said, I've written about 20 odd stage plays and other things that they are as of nothing if I look at one of my children.
Right. Is it public knowledge that your marriage has broken if it has broken up? And is that why this question is so dangerous?
It could be very serious. I mean, for people, Joe, if,
all right.
Like I'm not, if it were myself,
right.
Like I don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
I have said on other occasions that, in fact, I was asked about living apart from my family, and that I cannot speak for the other people, but in terms of friendship, and in terms, I know that my love has not diminished, and in terms of friendship with the members of my family, I feel that by and large the friendship is greater, because there is a manic depressive element to the nature of the work. You lock yourself up all day, and the process can go on for as many as 2 years, and weekends mean nothing, and that you emerge out of a room still carrying something that is in fact impossible to write. As you, at the start of any work, it would appear to be impossible, and you are attempting the impossible because it's out
of your reach. And through some form of masochistic discipline, concentration, that my concentration, you've probably noticed on questions here, it's very, very poor. So hence it is a double surprise, a great surprise to me that I can, that there's a tenacity there with the play to pursue it to the end.
Right.
And that I have achieved, as far as I'm concerned. I'm not saying plays are good, bad, or indifferent, but as far as I'm concerned, the whole thing seemed impossible at the start, and I've got to some conclusion in it.
Mm-hmm.
I've another one, this is slightly tangential, but that a sort of maxim that I've had for a good few years, and that is, if you can do it, why bother? If you can't, try. And that's putting pressure on myself, trying to aim higher than the self. I didn't particularly decide this myself, but that is an attitude I have. That is bound to put strains on a family situation. And then, of course, when a work is done, or when one arrives at a big punctuation mark, which may be at the end of a first draft, at the end of the second draft, and that one feels like a dog that has been locked up for 2 weeks. In the case of the writer, it might be 2 months or 3 months, and that you let the dog out and he starts to chase the wind. And hence the artists that go crazy around town drinking or shouting or whatever they're up to, that the domestic is the last thing you want, because you have been chair-bound in a house, more than likely is the room in a domestic situation. And the last thing that one wants is the domestic. Though the immediates have been waiting patiently for the emergence of a social animal, the social comforts and love and so on that they have to give them are not sufficient to the needs, and the artist continues selfishly.
As part of the response after that, you read of how many writers, would that be a reason to immerse oneself in substances in that time off when one gets out of the room, one chases the wind? Some people I might know in the rock industry would go frantically after doing an album or something, they go frantically into cocaine abuse or something, or drinking a lot.
Well, certainly there is there's an attempt to numb the skull, to numb it to a degree that paradoxically one achieves a total degree of a non-inhibited form of expression that one wants to have, and that the self is forgotten, and perhaps also that to also kill this feeling of guilt that one has about the family that has put up with the bear for all those months.
Would you be in control of that pattern, or has that pattern been in control of you?
I'm in control of it to the extent that I do it, and I've almost always done it. I've almost always also carried a guilt about with me because of doing that. So I've no control over the guilt, but I have to indulge myself in some sort of debauch of socializing.
All those questions came out of the conversation rather than off the page. Could I take a phone number? I will only call you if I've really got a quote that I think is in any way perilous. Okay?
970-363.
No, I'm very sensitive.
An object lesson there for interviewers when it comes to how at times it's best to go with your gut and, frankly, feck to one side your preset questions. Though here I must say that I rarely stick exclusively to the script, and soon, with Murphy, we'd be off flying organically again. But I did ask Tom a preset question to kick off this next section.
A critical response I read to A Whistle in the Dark was that it exposed a side of the Irish psyche most would rather see unexplored, or at least presented on stage, like the dark primal forces. Is that how you interpreted that negative reaction?
And that type of reaction to it is refusing to admit a truth. I don't know what else I can say.
The truth about those dark primal forces within us and around us, and that side of. Do you see part of that growing out of the Christian tendency, not just Christian perhaps, tendency to venerate the God and goodly side and to vindicate the darker link with Satan, devil side.
Well, there's certainly an element of that there. I would say that there's a big lie, the Christian lie that we live. I often feel that if Christ was the magician that he was, why did he have to shed his blood? Surely he could have redeemed mankind through some other trick. Secondly, it's part of Christian understanding that we're all brothers. We have proved time and time again that we're not brothers, which is a refusal to admit to Cain and Abel. Mm-hmm. We will read about Cain and Abel as the first murderer, but as a fairy tale in the Bible. But that if we agreed to the primal scream that Cain and Abel gave at each other, and then Cain killed Abel, that were we to admit that power is within us to do this sort of thing, and these forces are there, that is a much better foundation to say, I mustn't kill you now, but if you say we are brothers, that we're based on a lie, and I think that it's more likely that you will take a swing at me or I will take a swing at you. Whereas if you say, look, it is possible that you will, because it has happened so often, mm-hmm. but we are a civilized force, we are Christian people, so we don't do that. But people try to deny the truth, the denial of the dark. In my case, when we're talking about moods and the nature of personalities of writers, it is generally felt that writers are frequently depressives, manic depressives. And that I would say that most writers, though sometimes we need treatment, etc. But I think that we also try to celebrate the dark colours as well as the light colours.
In the Sheely concert, JPW King finally turns to Satan at the end. Is that part of your own process? Because God isn't going to deliver, or God hasn't delivered. So is that part of your own process of embracing?
God doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist.
God is people. There's a line in the play, JPW says, God created the world in order to create himself. Mm-hmm. Us, we are God. Mm-hmm. So by this mumbo jumbo of talking to God, all right, I have part of the thing that the play is trying to do is, and indeed other plays that I've written, is that we ourselves are the people who can fly eventually. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're trying to fly. We won't fly through appealing to something that isn't there. We collectively are the thing that we try to pretend is up there or down there.
Right, but we are the joining of both forces.
The good and evil.
Yeah, the satanic and the godly.
Yeah.
Right. Is part of the people have described it as anti-clerical, others have described it as anti-Christian dimension running through your work. Would part of that be a rage against the loss of being centered in one's faith, like an anger at losing that?
Some of
too?
it, I think you're dead right in that when people talk about the fact that I write different plays, I see threads, the same threads frequently running through my plays, and in answer to your question, that frequently the character emerges in the play, mm-hmm. who is the most harsh, the most violent, all of those sort of things, but that I know that he originally, or she, but it's usually he, was the most innocent and idealistic and right. so on. So that I think that the more idealistic that one is, that when the disenchantment sets in, that the more dangerous the person.
Right, and the more you kick out against the loss of all those idealisms.
Next up, quoting a comment Tom had made to Kieran Carty from the Sunday Tribune, I made the mistake of using the word either rather than both. But Tom, quite rightly, corrected me.
He told Kieran Carty in 85, my generation was brought up with the idea that a woman belonged on a pedestal or on her back. Would you now see that either view is offensive to women?
I would see both views as being equally offensive to women. Perhaps my own coming of age, despite my grand old age, has only happened in the last 10 years. I seem increasingly to be trying to write for women, with hopefully a greater understanding, a growing fascination, always fascinated by them, but a growing one in terms of
Oh, a gentleness, a softness, an aspiration, an intelligence that is there, that seems to know better where it stands, that is, where the female stands, than where the male stands. That we seem to be still trying to write plays and chasing our tail, and so on.
Someone said of you, would you have been wounded by the comment around the time of Whistle in the Dark that you knew nothing about women?
Well, that was said to me on my first night ever.
Right.
And that has stayed in my mind, and it is in my mind to this day, not to do with my personal life or the degree of socializing that I do, but I frequently think about it when I'm working.
But can you disassociate it from your personal life? Now, we don't want to go back into that area, but would you say you had healthy relationships with women? Or would that ignorance have extended outwards?
I feel that I'm an evolved form of Tom Murphy from Chum. I must be, or else I should be shot.
Okay, wait, but so would you have used? You did also use the plays. You have, as you were talking about, the well-developed roles for women. Many people have commented on them, in particular plays like The Morning After Optimism, A Soul for Famine, the Sheely Concert. Did you use that as a kind of part of your own learning process?
In what way?
In writing these roles and pushing yourself to further understand women, that the learning process came through the plays.
Yes, to a large extent. Yes is the answer to that. There's another aspect to it that I used to look at. I lived in London for the best part of the decade of the 60s, and it says time for me to write about English people. And I used to shrink back from that in terms of I didn't know the English, and yet the English were part of my life. I was there for 10 years. Similarly, when I started to think about women, I better start writing parts for women. I thought, well, they are a race apart.
Mm-hmm.
But the trick, if you like, that I've discovered, and people have been very complimentary about some of the women's characters I've written, and they say, well, of course, you know Mary so-and-so, or Delia so-and-so, or Julia so-and-so. And that my little secret, I told you I was telling all, is that it comes from me as a woman, that in the way that I try to write a character who is more stupid or more intelligent than myself, there's an almost automatic now adjustment to the biologism, if you like. That's a nice word. The female biologism, for one thing.
That this attempt. I mean, Williams wrote out of it, and Lawrence wrote out of it. Lawrence wrote about it. The attempt to reconcile the opposing forces. I mean, is that a seedbed of creativity for you too, or is, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Or is that too simplistic?
No, not at all. That perhaps there's some sort of attraction in that for me, and that in looking at female characters, and I noticed that the nature of characters I've written, say in Ballygongora, that Act 1 shows two women embracing each other, and they are in a really terrible, fucked up situation in their lives, and there seems to be no light in the future, and none coming from the past, and there doesn't seem to be a present for them because nothing is coming from those polarities. But the two women embrace, and I think I did this rather consciously,
Right.
and that through stuff like that, I'm only speculating myself about it at the moment, and I hadn't thought about it in the way you're questioning me.
Right. No, it's just that when you talked earlier about the synthesis of Satan and God and those forces, and I've seen the Carl Jungian model of the world imposed on your work or read through your work in terms of synthesizing masculine and feminine. I mean, would they be concepts you'd be aware of, or again, is this the kind of applied after the event syndrome?
No, though I have read some of Jung, and I've read
Other various great thinkers, that my reading, and this may be a lacking or it may be a bonus, that similar to the fact that there is some sort of substrata of politics and sociology there that can be found by people. But that comes out of my absorbing life, that similarly, the stuff I read, I seem to have an ability to read it and forget it, or to read it and not understand it, or to read it and apprehend it as against comprehend it.
Right, and it will find its way.
It will find its way out.
Because I saw also a Freudian analysis of one of your works, I can't remember which it was, saying that, like about against repression, that it was striking out against all the forces we repress within ourselves. And the end of maybe like which play would it have been? At the end of the play, actually, the resolution is that you confront those forces within yourself.
Yeah,
but again,
I don't know what play that is, but that sort of interpretation makes sense, because in the nature of how I'm trying to write, and that I'm not trying to write new plays or novel plays so that one is totally different from the last, but it is a writer fighting for room, space for myself. It's almost as if the emotion, the pursuit of some spiritual and then third, very much a third, whatever intellectual input is there, that I'm trying to push back walls from myself to breathe.
Right, was one of the walls I saw that A Crucial Week was described as a savage attack on the Irish mammy, and it was either you who suggested or another, or a critic who did, who said it was also attack on the matriarchal figure in terms of ecclesiastical authority in tune.
Well, I would say that we're perhaps back to the autobiography again, that I was a man who grew up almost without my father, that my mother was the figure of authority in the house. She was the matriarch. And I lived in that house more or less until I was 27 years of age. I recall that in the last 5 years of my life there, that when she made attempts to make conversation, I said yes or no. I know that she wanted more conversation than that from me. But in a way, I'd found a civilized way of dealing with a pressure that she, as the figure of authority, was putting on the house, and it was too much. But I remained civilized within it. I expect that certainly mood-wise in the play, there is an element of autobiography there. Also, I found when I was growing up that I found a great harshness in Irish women. And hence, I think the fact that I married an English woman made total sense to me. Subsequent upon that, when I wrote a play called Famine, which is the first time I really started to try and explore for myself distinctions, if there were any, between the husband and wife, I decided, like O'Casey, unlike him in another way, that the woman, of course, was the real heroic figure. And that in talking about mentalities of Irish people becoming twisted because of the nature of the history, that I found it began to learn, and it was more understandable how a woman's mentality should become more twisted.
Would this have given you a deeper understanding then of your mother?
Indeed, it did, yeah.
Right. Yeah. But you had a, what do you want to call it, pain, bitterness, anger, need to rebel against a particular power for a time in your life.
Yes, I'm sure that is correct. I'm not hesitating over the answer. It's only because I remember myself as being extremely quiet. The rebellion was happening inside. When I started to write with my friend Noel O'Donoghue, and then started to write the second play, A Whistle in the Dark, I think that whether or not I had talent as a writer then or now is immaterial, in that I'd found a natural form of therapy for myself. And I seem to remember, the jaws were tense and stiff, writing this out in school copybooks on a Friday night and a Saturday night, and getting some great relief from it, some therapy, some catharsis happening. That, here again, the reason why one becomes a writer, that the outlet is not banging doors or being saying shit or fuck to one's mother.
Again, I saw Patrick Mason describe the Shealy concert as, again, people in combat, wrestling with the Dark Angel. That this is continuing, because I've seen this other description of your later work, that there is a point, that the later works mark a point of resolution, and that there is a move from the unremittingly tragic perspective of the first work or second work to a glimmer of hope.
I'd describe it as more than a glimmer.
Right.
On the thing of wrestling with the Dark Angel, I've been told that I've been tempting suicide. Not tempting suicide, tempting sanity.
It was in the work.
In how I approach it, and sometimes almost like fighting a disease, to say that I'm going to get the better of this work. The work isn't going to beat me, I'm going to beat the work. Well, that means I go into some form of
Mortal Kombat.
I wouldn't be as extreme, but some sort of combat, and that means dealing with very, very dark forces, but that it's as if one has to go into the abyss to come out of it.
I saw a line in one of the plays, rock bottom is my basis, you know, and that is an extension of what you've just said. But does that indicate that in the pit of the abyss, so right down at the end of the abyss, you do have to relinquish faith in everything, in all those idealisms before you can kind of come back out? And that may be in family, church, state, religion, drunkenness, states of escape, theatre, writing. You know, is there this route you have to go to? To stand naked, to stand what you describe as naked.
I think there is. I'm not at all suggesting that I do it every time. I don't have that sort of courage.
Right.
The state that we're talking about is the one of, we were talking about selfishness earlier, but it is a point of complete unselfishness on the part of the writer, who is saying, I'm ready to lay down my life for this. It is an extreme form of saying petty. You search for a word. You're trying to think of somebody who was in a film. What was that film star's name? And you can't think of it. And then when you stop, 10 minutes later, you come.
Yeah.
That, in a way, can be interpreted as an act of humility, and that you're rewarded by, say, your own little mind can't come up with the resolution.
Right.
In this case, it's very difficult to talk of it out of context or to understand it out of context, because it is through the sheer slog, day after day after day after day after day, that one arrives at this point. And there's some great act, I think, of humility. And it's not so much that there's a blinding flash, but as frequently is that one is rewarded by the obvious. The obvious is the thing that has been escaping a person. But that wrestling with the darkness is it's wrestling with boredom. It's becoming totally frustrated, neurotic, maybe depressed, and then saying, what is all this depression and so on about? That, okay, I'm useless, I'm hopeless, I'm at my wit's end, I am in the pit.
It's like a wonderful paradox, though, isn't it? Because it's like you have to push the self down into the bowels of the self to transcend the self finally.
Well, you can't do it without the preparation. The moments of inspiration that happen, they only happen as it would appear some sort of a reward for the doggedness, the months of doggedness that have gone before that you have made your nerve ends raw to receive some sort of inspiration.
Listening to Tom again, I have to say that this may be one of my favourite interviews ever. It certainly influenced me profoundly as a writer, and I told Tom so and thanked him during a second interview we did in 2001, which is available on my website, joejacksoninterviewer.com. But to end this show, later, picking up on Tom's admittance that he wrote sections of plays as if they were arias, I asked if he'd been a singer, something he often said he wanted to be, he'd not have composed plays. He said no. I asked if he still believes all art aspires to the condition of music. Thank you for listening. to this little would-be one-act play, which I dedicate to the memory of Tom Murphy.
I used to think that, but I think that maybe that form of discipline that is required for singing isn't in me. I know that there is a discipline in what I do, but I've thought about that on a few occasions, because I used to think it would have been great to have been a singer, but I really think I've had a terrific life to date. I think I've had a very fulfilled life. I mean that genuinely. I met my oldest friend, O'Donoghue, about, it's certainly 12 years ago, both in our early 40s. And we hadn't seen each other for a couple of years. And he brought up a picture of class of 49 or something. He said, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead. And we have very little to say to each other. We have a lot to say to each other now, because there had to be a time of weaning ourselves into each other again. And he said at one stage, I reckon we've had a very good innings. And I didn't interpret it as solely pertaining to the class of 49 picture. But in whatever way I assessed my own life, I said, Jesus, I've been incredibly lucky. You know, I'm up and down and so on. But there's been an awful lot of celebration. You know, I bore people to death talking about my dark moods and that, but great life.
So you are, in a sense, a singer.
A singer through the world, hopefully.
It's perfect line for me.